Perfect. So guys, as I mentioned, right, my name is Adrien Fraise. I'm the CEO and founder of ModernGuild. Today's purpose is purely about trying to help you guys with personal branding, really surrounded around the interview. So what I'm going to do is spend 15, 20 minutes kind of going through a couple of slides just to try and acclimate people to what I think are the most important aspects of acing the interview. So as we go along, please make sure your phones are on mute so that it's easy for everyone to kind of hear. And then feel free to jump in at any point to ask questions along the way, but we'll have a big Q&A session at the end so we can kind of field whatever questions everybody has. But with that, let me just dive in. And again, please, everyone put their phones on mute or your computers on mute so there's no echoes. But ultimately, I look at acing the interviews in 3 different buckets: research, practice, and execute. So what do I mean by all of that? So let's go through it. What I mean by that is, let me see if I can open up these slides. Perfect. So research. So some of this is basic stuff, right? But at a bare minimum, you guys have to do basic research on the company that you're interviewing with. Easiest is obviously go to their website, right? Better is to do some Google News search, right? See what's happening if you can, if it's a big enough company, what's going on. The third is kind of to start looking at different reports, annual reports if they have it, 10Ks, et cetera, quarterly reports. So you can kind of get a sense of what's going on with the company. By the way, I'm just noticing, can everyone hear me? So I just got a message that somebody can't hear me. So I just want to make sure that
yes, I can hear you pretty good.
Okay, perfect. So again, everyone put their phones on mute if you can. So again, do research on companies, do Google News searches so you understand the company. And 3, try and read whatever investor documents you can, right? So that you get really smart about what they're doing. That's just the research side that you control. But once you get that basis, the next most important thing is actually to network with industry professionals, ideally in the industry and obviously ideally at those companies, but in safe environments so that you can validate some of the information that you're gathering, right? So whatever you're reading about, whatever you're hearing about, you want to go and validate so that way you become even smarter and really understand the insider perspective of the industry and the company that you're targeting. So that when you go into the interview, you're much smarter and hopefully have much better questions to ask, right? So again, I'm going to ask everyone, please put your microphones on mute. It seems like some people still are not on mute, so if you can do that, or your computer, so that it's a little bit easier to hear. I'm a big dork, so I actually do this in a way where I actually fill out a cheat sheet. So I actually compare every single company in the same cheat sheet as a way of doing my research, right? So I kind of understand the company. I put information into this cheat sheet. I see what's happening, most current news. That way I have a real easy reference point to go back to. But that's essentially how I think about the world of research. The networking is really, really important. And it's not just because you talk to one person. Everyone kind of thinks a little bit differently, particularly even within a company. But if you think about the industry, if you're thinking about consulting, someone at McKinsey may think differently than somebody at Accenture. Someone at Accenture, as Victoria pointed out, that's in manufacturing or heavy industrial may have a slightly different opinion than someone who is doing technology consulting or in consumer or customer marketing strategy, right, or M&A. So it's really good to try and triangulate multiple points of view across the industry and within the company so that you can truly validate your thinking. Now, you can't do that for obviously every single company that you're targeting, but you can do that for the tier 1 priority companies that you really want. The 2, 3, or 4, that's where you can really invest some of that extra time to validate and make sure that you have real good research before you go in. So before I move on to the second topic around practice, does anybody have any questions about the research? If you do, feel free to unmute and ask, but go ahead.
No, I was just saying that all sounded good to me.
Perfect. Again, I can't stress the networking with industry professionals, right? And already at the top of the call, we've identified some people who are currently working in industry. We've identified someone at Morehouse who just worked in Deloitte internship. That's a resource. So the more that you can triangulate, the better. But obviously, I think this is pretty straightforward.
One thing to add to that.
Yeah.
I'm a student, but I have a few years working for the federal government and State Department. And I had a chance in Kenya at the embassy and State Department in Nairobi, and I had an opportunity where I had to work with third parties, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to be
Right.
specific. And I was so surprised that I went to my predecessor, and he said to help your learning curve, 6 months before I interact with PwC, he got me reading the Financial Times, The Economist, and actually connected me with a platform which has a lot of good information, Bloomberg. So I
Right.
found when I later interacted, my financial IQ and awareness of that triangulation and synergy really was at a different level, and I found I could be more effective for the government.
So that's a perfect example. So I appreciate you sharing that. At the end of the day, you want to be able to speak the language, and you want to be fluent, obviously, but you also want to show off your intellectual curiosity in an interview. Doing the research gets you up to a certain level of comfort. Doing the triangulation of speaking to folks so that you can really contextualize that information and then be able to articulate it in smart ways is what separates the kind of A or B plus, A minus or B plus candidate from the A candidate. So thank you for sharing that. I guess in terms of, and by the way, just interject at any point if people have questions, but just going into the next area really quickly around practice. I kind of find it 5 or 6 steps depending on how you want to look at this slide. And hopefully, can you guys all see these slides well enough or no? I'm going to try and blow it up a little bit. Hopefully you can see that. But basically, there's a couple of different steps to interviewing, in my opinion. And I think most of you hopefully have done this. And if you haven't, hopefully you will. But there's the obvious, which is you need to practice on your own, right? So call it the mirror practice, right? Where you're forcing yourself to be in an awkward situation, look at yourself, whether it's using FaceTime and recording it or some type of computer recording device or in front of a mirror, whatever you want to call it. But force yourself to see yourself go through the interview process and be your number one critique. That's kind of stage 1. Stage 2 is to do that in front of a classmate, particularly somebody who is interviewing in the same industry that may have a little bit of knowledge and may actually want some work and feedback back from you. So many of you have gone through our accelerators. What we do is typically create study groups, right, or study teams. So you have a study buddy when you go through the accelerator, and that's meant to not only give you kind of a peer support to continue to practice interviews or cases, but it's also to allow you to have someone that you feel more and more comfortable with after the accelerator to continue your training, right? Because the accelerator can get you so much information, it's pretty crammed in, but then you need to continue to be at a high throttle afterwards, right? So having that study buddy is a nice thing. But whether it's a study buddy, whether it's just your friend down the hall or whatnot, try to do mock interviews in real simulated ways, not where you jump out and cut out of kind of role playing, right? You stick to your role playing and go through interviews. Obviously, practice makes perfect, and that's an easy, safe environment way to get a little bit more confident. So that's stage 2. Stage 3 is about doing it with a experienced professional friend. So some people may say do it with a career center. Me personally, unless the career center person is from your industry, I don't think it's all that valuable. It could help you from a behavioral perspective. But I think what you're trying to do is find the Doug Bowen, right? The friend of yours at campus who worked at the company last summer, or an alum that you know, or a classmate or whatnot, friend and family in the industry, whatnot, and try and practice with them, right? So that way it feels a little bit more real. That person has a little bit more kind of proxy knowledge to the industry, if not knows the industry, and that's going to help you increase your confidence level. That's stage 3. Once you cross that threshold, it then goes into what I call real interviews and how to practice in reality as opposed to just in mock simulation. So stage 4 is all about doing a real interview with somebody, right? Typically, I would argue outside of your target industry. So for the person on the call who mentioned earlier that she's interviewing with JP Morgan Chase, you may want to interview, and maybe too late now, but just as an example, you may want to interview with GE or some other business entity that likely has similar-ish types of questions, maybe not quite the financial technical, but business heavy, pretty serious, right, type of firm. You may have zero interest in them, but the ability to kind of get comfortable in a real environment with somebody of high caliber, right, a company of high caliber, is going to create real confidence in you and get the rust off. That way, when you get finally in front of a real interview within your industry, or more importantly, within your industry at your target company, your priority 1 companies, you're going to be a well-oiled machine. So that leads into stage 5 and stage 6, where it's once you get comfortable doing real interviews, right, in a high octane way that is obviously feels different than a mock interview, then you can start interviewing within your target industry. Hopefully, if you can dictate this at companies that aren't necessarily in your tier 1 because you'd rather do them a little bit later once you're more and more comfortable. But obviously, sometimes you can dictate that time schedule. So when you know consulting is coming to town, being able to get a 1 or 2 or 3 interviews with other companies before the typical consulting frenzy, that's what I'm trying to push here. And then the more and more you can dictate whether you meet with McKinsey first or Oliver Wyman or a smaller boutique, right? Obviously better as much as possible to interview with those 2nd tier, 3rd tier priority companies of yours so that you have a lot more practice under your belt or real live interviews before you go in front of your top tier companies. So I'll take a pause there after practice. Anybody have any questions around the, what I think are the best methods of practice?
Hi, Adrien. So this is Maria again. I was wondering, what do you, for the real interviewer for your non-target industry, are you recommending that we apply to other companies that are not our target to go through interviews?
Yes, I am. And that might sound really weird. But so, for example, when I was at Stanford, let's just say consulting typically came for like consulting and banking would come for like a 2 or 3 week concentrated period, right? You'd have like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, probably all the same day. Then 2 days later would be another 3 or 4 companies, 5 days later. So if there were companies already interviewing on campus, I would go interview at Caterpillar, at GE, right? Because even though I may not put a lot of practice into that, the ability just to be in a real environment is super, super helpful, right? So get the rust off before you go in front of those companies. So you're probably a little bit more well-oiled at this point. But if you were starting the fall recruiting season, my point is that you don't want to go in front of a bank, particularly a bank you care about the most, as your first interview. So signing up for something that might be interesting, maybe it's a hedge play, whatever you want to call it, but having a real interview with a company that's within a business umbrella, but not in your exact industry or not at your exact target companies is hugely helpful just to get at least the behavioral, the basic competency types of questions under your belt.
What if all the interviews were happening at the same time? Because that's currently what's happening on campus right now.
Right. So again, problem is how much can you dictate, right? And how much command you have the timing. And it's getting harder and harder these days because everything is moving up more and more, right? So what used to be October, November timeframe for all interviews for senior fall, which doesn't even exist anymore. Now it's like all being crammed in like a 3-week period at the beginning of October, end of September. So it's getting harder and harder. But there are ways of figuring that out, right? There are ways of trying to interview with people. Maybe it's not on campus, maybe it's off campus prior to going back to school. My simple point is, as much as possible where you can, try to interview in low risk environments first before going to the high risk environment, which is the things you care most about. Now, again, to your point, may be hard to do, but there are ways of at least trying to interview with some companies a little bit earlier if you can.
Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts? Okay. So in terms of executing, I'm just going to give you some quick interview gaming tips. Some of this may be obvious to many of you. Some of you, maybe it's just good new stuff. But many times when you interview, you can sign up for a interview slot time, right? Particularly if it's on campus. I know sometimes you may not be able to, but in many cases you can. From a psychological perspective, right? If you put yourself in the seat of an interviewer who's coming to campus, they typically interview like 10 kids in a row, right? Maybe with a lunch break. It's like nauseating. I mean, I've probably interviewed over 1,000 people, right? It's so tiring after a while. So the only comparable I can give you guys in terms of maybe something you've gone through in college is I remember when I was a freshman, I hated the rush process for fraternities and sororities. As a person rushing, I thought it was horrible to have to go to all these stupid events. Just like in recruiting, you have to go to all these events, right? I thought that was terrible. Then I became a member of a fraternity. And I thought, oh my God, hosting all these rushees is 10 times worse than being a rushee, right? Because you got to talk to everyone and all that. Same thing for an interviewer. You have to interview 10 people who they've never met, that they don't know, and somehow retain information on these kids, right? It gets really boring and everyone starts to blend together. So tip number one, knowing that, is psychologically, if you can make a big first moment or a big last moment, people remember you. Just like the opening of a debate, right? Or the opening of your elevator pitch, right? How you start and conclude is really important in terms of anchoring the person. So 2 points on this list of 5 that talk about that is how well you do in the beginning of an interview and how well you do at the end of the interview, but also when you interview. So if possible, and if you have the choice, try and always sign up for the first time slot or the last time slot, because those in the middle start to blend together. So if you can put yourself in a better position, then you should take it. And typically speaking, being first or last creates an easier time for the interviewer to remember you. And if you do a strong opening and strong conclusion, that helps anchor the interviewer to remember you even further. So those are 2 tips. Third tip is around personal branding. Every single person who made an introduction at the beginning of this call did it slightly differently. We had some that didn't really introduce themselves, just said what their name was. Others that gave some level of credentials, right? So that elevator pitch at the beginning, which is always going to be, walk me through your resume, tell me about why you're here, whatever that form of that first kind of layup opener question is, you have to nail it, right? And you have to nail it not just in a way of proving your credentials professionally and why they care about you, particularly around why you care about their industry, but you have to have some thread of personal, right? Not too much focus, but some thread of personal so they don't think of you in robotic ways, right? If you just regurgitate your resume, nobody cares, right? So that's table stakes. Heavy credentializing yourself. You obviously want to give some level of humanness through personal, but you need some type of imagery or anchor moment or graphic or whatever you want to call it that is very easy for them to recall who you are. So in my case, when I introduced myself, particularly when I was doing interviewing, I either did one of 2 things, if not both. My last name is Fraise, which means strawberry in French, right? My family is also French from Madagascar. Those 2 things are very unique. Most people can't say that their last name means strawberry, and most people have never met someone from Madagascar. So using that in my opening pitch to that first question was a way of anchoring the interviewer to remember me. And I guarantee you, for many of you, if they come to campus, they're usually there 2 days in a row because they do first round and second round. Sometimes they make decisions that night to say whether you come back to second round, et cetera, or maybe it's a week period of time, but they usually come together and debrief. And most people, as I mentioned, can't even remember half the people they've met because they've been 2 days of nonstop interviews. That's 20 people. How the hell do you even distinguish between them anymore, right? So if you're absolutely amazing, they'll probably remember you. If you're absolutely terrible, they'll probably remember you. But most of you are pretty damn good. So how do you differentiate yourself? I did it by saying very simply, hey, pleasure to meet you, right? My name's Adrien Fraise. I'm the youngest of 3 brothers, and my family's French from Madagascar, even though we were born in the United States and went to American schools our entire lives, right? I'm a double major in political science and economics at Stanford, blah, 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 blah. I didn't dwell on my personal, but I did it in a way so someone knew I was human, that I had family, and most importantly, that I anchored them on Madagascar. Because when they go into their debrief, they're probably not saying, who else met Adrien? Because they're probably not going to remember me. But if someone said, who met the Madagascar kid? They're all going to say, oh, yeah, the Madagascar kid. Then you just have to pray that they remember you for good reason, because the rest of the interview was good as opposed to bad. But if they can't even remember you, you're at a massive disadvantage. And trust me, most of you are in the B plus A minus range. So you want to make sure that you up your potential. So that's a big, big tip that I would provide you. Fourth is smart questions. So what do I mean by smart questions? I think there's actually 3 different layers of questions that you can ask at the end of the interview. And typically you should get that, right? Where someone says, well, do you have any questions for me? So what are the 3 layers of questions that you can ask? One is generic. right? You have some smart, generic questions that you can ask almost any interviewer, any company, any industry, right? Not great, but at least you have something, right? So that's called it the outer thread, right? So stuff like, well, tell me a little bit about your company culture, or this, that, or the other. Those aren't great questions because we hear them all the time, but it's better than not having a question. If you don't have a question, it's a massive, in my opinion, a massive negative, because it means that you're not intellectually curious. How can you not have a question for me? How can you not be trying to gather information? In consulting, for example, or even a large case, you could argue most positions, right, business analyst positions, you're in front of clients. You're researching, you're gathering information, right? If you have an opportunity to gather information with somebody at a company you're interested in, how are you not gathering information? It makes no sense. And if you feel like every single question has been answered, then you probably didn't research and prepare well enough, right? So to me, no question is a massive ding because you ended the interview on a sour note. And it's also your opportunity, just like the opener is kind of a softball question. This is a softball question too. You can conclude with a strong statement about yourself by asking smart, intelligent questions. So have generic questions, but hopefully you can get away from that outer layer and get a little bit more to a better core type of question. So the second layer of types of questions are questions that are industry specific, right? Maybe even company specific. So it shows that you've done research. Not that you're trying to show how brilliant you are as if you know their industry and their company more than they do, because trust me, you don't. You don't want to go down that path because you may just sound stupid, right? But you want to ask intelligent questions that shows that you care about them, that you're creating empathy. So, questions about things that you've read about. Oh, it's interesting to see that you guys did this big merger and acquisition. Was that complicated given some of the regulations that were occurring, blah, 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 blah. That shows, wow, this kid actually reads, right? Knows the markets, knows this, right? That makes someone feel like you care about them and you care about their company. So that's a second better layer, deeper, if you want, towards the core of best questions. The best type of question, in my opinion, is somewhat what we just talked about, but done in a way that shows that you're actually adapting it to the conversation you just had. Now, there's two ways of doing that. It's really about the conversation you just had, or you're just simply being smart about how you package your question so it sounds like it's part of the discussion you've had. So, for example, well, you mentioned earlier that you work in M&A. Well, I'm very interested in learning more about that because I read about X, Y, and Z, so I'd be curious to get your opinion. That shows active listening skills. It also shows two-way communication. So it shows that you're actually not only caring because you're preparing and you want to know more, but you're actually listening to the interview. It's not just a one-way communication. You're doing two-way now. You've processed information, you've shown active listening skills, and you've been able to ask follow-up questions based off of that. So that's a huge plus, right? It makes the person feel more comfortable, but it also shows a real skill set of yours. So that's smart questions, what I mean by that. Move away from generic, try to get more to industry and company specific, and try to kind of embed it as part of a two-way conversation that you're learning and asking questions on the fly almost, even though it may not be, but you're packaging as if it is, so that it feels like you're showing active listening skills and that you care about the conversation you're having with the individual. So that's the fourth. The fifth, lastly, a little bit of an archaic art, but I'm still a believer in it, that you need to send a thank you note that has a nice personalized line in it. So it's not just copy and paste, but a one specific sentence in there, short, concise, couple of sentences, but one that literally says something you learned or appreciated as part of the interview, so that the person knows that you actually spent a couple of minutes to care when you wrote it. And you need to send it within 24 hours, if not earlier. Again, email is fine, right? But you need to send it early. And the reason why, as I mentioned, several of these companies may be on your campus and may be making round 2 decisions that night, right? So if you know there's a time pressure, more important for you to get that thank you note out prior to 6, 7 p.m. that night when they may be debriefing. If you know round 2 is a little bit later, then you have a little bit more comfort. But general process is that you want to send a thank you note within 24 hours. The other thing beyond the obvious, which it shows that it's helping show that you're polite, right? That you have a certain level of manners, which means potentially we can put this person in front of a client. The second is that you're doubling down on your recall. Remember, we want people to remember who you are. By sending a cover note, they're remembering. The third is that you're displaying written skills, that you actually know how to write something professionally. That also gives people comfort about whether we can put you in front of a client, whether you have some kind of basic written professional skills, because we didn't test that in the interview. So I think for all of those reasons, it's really important. And obviously the most that you're creating more and more empathy and more relationship with that person, right? I can tell you from my experience, when we would go into these debrief rooms, while you didn't necessarily get dinged if you didn't write the thank you note, because in some cases we can't expect people to do so within an hour of interviewing, right? That's a little ridiculous. But if you did, it could only help you, unless you wrote the worst thing on earth and said, thank you, Goldman Sachs, when you're writing to JP Morgan. But the point is, then people were like, oh, that person said a really nice thank you note. That may get you out of the A-, B+ pile and into the A pile, right? So for all those reasons, I think the thank you note is important. And it really does show your skills and an ability for you to make sure that you conclude once again better. So I'll stop right there. Not sure how obvious some of these things are for all of you, but do you have any questions about some of those interview gaming tips that I just covered? Is that helpful?
Yes, it is, greatly. Thank you.
Any thoughts or questions?
Hey, Adrien, this is Victoria. I kind of wish I had remembered this stuff when I was going through the process. You had some great tips. Another thing that I did that kind of helped was I just set on Google Alerts, and then as the keyword, I put whatever company I was interviewing at.
Yep.
So throughout the day, I could just kind of get notifications and scroll through just to get an idea of what was going on with that company, and then also within the industry. So it was helpful as well.
So Victoria, great point. So going back to what we were talking about earlier around the research, many of you, and I'm not trying to make a negative judgment call on what you guys do, but at least I did, and many of the students we talked to, you tend to do a lot of the interview prep the night before, 2 days before. And so that means that if you're a smart person, you're like doing your Google News search to what, Victoria was mentioning, like you might do a Google search and look at news and whatnot. But what Victoria is mentioning is creating more of a sustained level of information, right? So if you're going to interview for consulting, or you're going to interview for finance, or whatever it is, you should be getting weekly, if not daily, digests about the industry, right? You can do that simply by doing Google News alerts, and they package that at the end of day, every week, so you get articles on what's going on with the company, the industry. That way you're just constantly getting osmosis over a longer period of time, so it's not just a cram. You actually know what's going on. You do that for a month before interviews, or even during interviews, you're going to be a lot more intelligent about what are the 2 or 3 major things that are bothering people on the street, right? So JP Morgan Chase, right, for example, you should absolutely be doing that. You should also be reading maybe Nespresso or whatever it is, right, to get your economists trends, right, the top stories. Being able to know what's going on every week. What are the 3 or 4 biggest stories in the market, right? Even if you don't read the Wall Street Journal cover to cover, Financial Times or whatnot, just being able to know what are the 2 or 3 biggest stories and what should I be aware of. The world has become so easy technology-wise for you to be able to get that. Before, you would have to read everything to figure out what were the 2 or 3 biggest things. Now people are screening that, doing it, providing it to you on your fingertips. So it's gotten so easy that you should just have to do this. And I guess the bar of expectations is increased because information is so much easier to come by. So Victoria's point about just even doing Google News alerts on the company or industry, whether it's daily or weekly, is super important so that you're getting smart as you go along as opposed to just the night before. And I would even push it further in saying that if you're in a certain industry, you should be subscribing to some type of news source, right? Not Wall Street Journal source, but like some type of analytical news source, right? That's processing what are the biggest news and trends, whether it's Business Insider and some of their cool stories. And then you're reading about that and digesting it. You don't have to read the stories cover to cover, but Business Insider is a perfect example of that, where you can read smart stories in short snippets or videos that get you pretty smart pretty quickly. So I highly recommend that. And to Victoria's point, it's not the night before. it can be done over a more sustained period of time during the interview process. So it's real knowledge and real osmosis occurs. Other questions or thoughts?
I had a question on how to research maybe the interviewers, or the quickest route to get access to possibly, because I'm trying to research alumni of big accounting firms coming out of Atlanta. So I'm trying to, and I can save this question for the end, but I just want to learn as much about the culture within the industry of the top two of the top 10 companies I'm looking at, and want to see going about it, because I can only get so much from peripheral reading, and I think getting that information will make me more aware, more competitive, but also get a jump on seeing if that company is the right fit for me.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think there's different layers of stakeholders, right, that you can talk to and get smart, right? And again, you have to always keep that lens of risk versus low risk, right? You certainly don't want to be talking to the CEO of the company that you want to work for on your first kind of research call, because everyone is evaluating you on some level, right? So always keep that in mind, by the way, right? You're not just evaluated at the interview. You're evaluated at the cocktail party, at the company presentation, at the interview workshop. They're constantly evaluating you. Trust me. There's actually like massive scoring sheets on every candidate that they meet, right? So that they know who should get the first round, or who should get a buddy attached to, right? So that they can have a champion at, McKinsey can tap you. So all of those things, just keep in mind, you're always being evaluated. So how do you do that? So keep in mind the risk factor. You go to school, you pay a lot of money, right? School works for you. You should get your school to start giving you information. If your alumni office doesn't have that information, if your career center doesn't, really bad on them. But they should be able to pull that out of a database very simply, if they don't already have some type of platform that you can access and do advanced searches in. So one is figure out, what do you have access to and what don't you, right? And then it's simple, right? You're either asking someone, or you're telling a system or a platform to search for something for you, and you're getting input, you're getting some results out of it. And then you'll be able to be smarter about who can I go reach out to. And the alma mater is a really easy one to use, because most people tend to be a little bit warmer about it, particularly if they're a recent grad. So start in the low risk, which means either someone still at school that just interned there, someone who's a recent grad that's at there. Those are lower risk people that you can kind of communicate with. But just keep in mind that not everyone works for you in terms of the real world, right? At the school they do. So when you reach out, be incredibly polite and conscious of people's time, right? And if someone does invest in you by taking a call, make sure that you invest back, right? It's not a one-way thing. People want to know if they got a relationship with you. You want to cultivate that relationship, because they may be helpful down the line, right? Either in information, who knows, maybe you get such a good relationship after a couple of calls throughout a year or 6 months that they may end up helping you get a job, right? But if you go into it like, I have a need, I want my need met, which is information, or give me a job interview, or this, that, or the other, people don't like you. It's just desperate. It's like bad dating skills, right? You don't try and get married on the first date. You try and get a sense if you even like each other, right? But a lot of times kids are just so in panic mode in the end of, right the last minute, that they end up doing that, and they almost take it for granted that people are willing to invest in them. So invest back, cultivate a relationship, make sure you update them on what's going on. So you should look at networking as like a year plan. I would meet someone, send them a thank you note. A month later, maybe send them something about the conversation we had. Oh, by the way, I noticed X, Y, and Z. I read this thing and I thought about our conversation, blah, blah, blah. Or 2-3 months. Hey, just want to give you an update on what's going on with my recruiting, because you were so helpful in helping me kind of shape some of my opinions. So I just wanted to let you know that I've got a second round, let's call it, and really excited about it, and we'll keep you posted. All of that stuff is like super low touch point for the person. They don't need to necessarily engage back, but it makes them feel part of you. It gives them ownership. It makes them want to like you. And then what you find is that people are saying, oh, you should talk to Samantha, right? Because Samantha knows somebody at JP Morgan Chase. They can be helpful, right? That's what you're trying to do with networking. It's not just purely squeezing a lemon to get whatever you want. Otherwise, you're not cultivating a relationship. But again, I would go, just to answer your question more directly, I would go figure out what tools you have at your disposal, search through those tools or resources or human resources, right, in your Career Center alumni, to find that list and start with the low-risk people, like people who formerly interned who are now still at school and or recent graduates. That's usually the best way to start. That helps get you a little bit smarter, helps you triangulate some information so that if you go to somebody who's a little bit more senior in the company or perhaps on the recruiting team at your school, right, that goes to campus to recruit for the company, then that's someone you want to be a little bit better and smarter before you have an informational with them, because they will tend to probably evaluate you on some level, right? I'm not saying it's like an interview, but my point is there is some level, and you obviously want to create a positive impression with everyone you meet, right? So with the riskier, more sensitive people that you really want to create a good impression, you should tend to not do them first. Just like you don't want to interview with your number one company in your number one industry first, right? Because that probably means you're not as well prepared. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Cool. Any other questions?
This is Victoria again. Yeah, I had a quick question. So you kind of touched on it should be more of a give and take relationship when you're asking someone, when you're reaching out to them for the first time. When you have that, or I guess when you send that initial email, is there like a good way to phrase like something that you can maybe offer them in return instead of just, hi, I'd love to get on the phone for 30 minutes to kind of pick your brain about the company or, ask how you've liked your experiences. So I found that initial email, that first reply back is kind of always the hardest one because they're not immediately aware of what you might be able to offer them.
So let me put it this way. It's like marketing or sales, right? Mm-hmm. Just like the company prioritization and all that stuff, you need to look at, let's just say you come up with a list of 50 alumni, right? 50 alums that fit your description. There's going to be 5 maybe, right? Maybe the top 10% of that list that are really important to you because they happen to be at X, Y, and Z company, or they happen to have some type of shared link with you, right? Those people, you're going to put more time and effort into creating a personalized email, right? Mm-hmm. Where you may have some information that's going to be valuable to them. It's not necessarily that you're offering them something, but it could be like, hey, I noticed that we both played crew, right? Then there's an even greater bond because the alumni, particularly like Victoria, you go to Michigan, right? My God, How many students go to Michigan? How many alumni are they? They get harassed all the time, right? And so like you can't expect that every alumni wants to alum wants to communicate back with you, right? It's like horrible. And by the way, 9 out of 10 connections are really painful, and you only get like an eHarmony moment 1 out of 10, right? So half the time I'm like banging my head against a wall when I talk to Stanford kids, right? Because they're ill prepared for the call. They're not nice. They take me for granted. It's like they want a job. It's like so transparent that they're just like desperate. It's just not fun. And then they never talk to me again, right? And then you never hear from them. And it's like, why did I even put effort in you? I don't even know if you did you get your JP Morgan Chase interview? Did it go well? Right? Like people care, if they're going to put time and effort into you, they care. So initially, think about it like sales or any marketing email that you send out, whether it's to convince people to come to your fraternity party, come to your dinner party, come to your club meeting, whatever it is. It's the same logic, right? There's a certain portion, a small one, that are priority 1. That means you're going to put more care in towards that email. You'll do a little more research so that you're trying to find the common link so that you can create a more likely bonding moment so that they're likely to respond higher, right? Certain messages work better, et cetera. So those people you'll try, and hopefully you have a higher reply rate, right? Click-through rate, whatever you want to call it. The second tier might be people like you kind of care about, but you don't necessarily need to do a fully personalized, but you'll try and find some way of creating some uniqueness in the email, right? About you, maybe about something you read about the industry or something, right? That feels different than the generic mass email, which is the third category for everybody else. What I tend to find is that most college students do the generic mass email and simply like change first name, change company name, and just send it out and say, I hope some of this sticks, right? like the shotgun approach. I'll send it out to 100 people, and hopefully I get a 5% conversion rate, 5% reply rate. That's like a bad mass mail marketing newsletter. That you do for everybody else. But for the ones that you want to cultivate a relationship, that you're hoping to close, that you feel like you have a stronger connection with, put a little more effort in. You can't do it for all 50, but you can certainly do it for 5. And then you can maybe do for 10 or 15. Maybe it's generic to them, but at least you've done some research in the industry or something that you think will relate to them. And then everybody else just gets the, hey, man, I'm Michigan. I know you're Michigan, blah, blah, blah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, very much so. Thank you.
But the follow-up is critical. Critical. I cannot say it enough. Because the whole point is to cultivate a relationship. And 99%, I made up that number, so don't quote me, but the vast, vast majority of college students, studies show, don't even do a second call or a second follow-up for that matter, period, right? So what's the point? I get that you don't need to do it with everyone. You may not have had a spark, but the people you do, you want to maintain. I'm the CEO of Modern Guild. I would argue less than 10% of students communicate to me, right? If I've ever given you an opportunity to communicate to me, you're insane not to. You're insane not to keep me updated. Do you know how many HR people I speak to on a daily basis? Right? I know them all, right? Like I'm certainly I don't mean this in a weird way, but I'm incredibly plugged in, right? And I have a high level viewpoint of how the marketplace works in terms of recruiting. That's extremely valuable information, right? So to me, I'm always shocked, right? The 10% that spend the time with me that I get to know, or the intern, or been an ambassador, or this, that, or the other, these people not only get so much attention from me, but they get a lot of attention from our team. That's only going to up your ability to present yourself better, to prepare better for your job, not just your interview, all those things. So I highly recommend that you take that approach, not just with me or Modern Guild, because we'll always try and help, but we don't know if you need help if you don't reach out. But you should take that approach with everyone that you're trying to seek information with, that you end up creating some level of spark, right? That you want to go on a second date or a third date, right? So I think the dating analogy, while a little crazy, is a good way to just kind of gut check yourself and think about this stuff. Because obviously if you care about someone from the offset, you're going to look a little bit better on your first date, right? You're going to try a little bit more, right? So it's the same, dating framework is the same kind of logic to recruiting framework. Other thoughts or questions that I can help with?
One quick question. Once you get the attention of and identify the company you wish to work for and you're on the interviewing slot, is there anything you can do outside of a thank you letter to remain connected to the interviewers or the company? For instance, going to a community service event, or maybe if you see them leaving your campus, joining them. Is that too much? You don't want to overkill a good presentation in your interview. Like, is there anything you find interviewees do too much that take away from their branding?
So look, at the end of the day, this is authentic, right? If there's no magic formula, right? But again, going back to dating, for example, right? You know when you're interested in someone and you think there may be interest back, right? You want to cultivate that. That doesn't mean that you're going to hang outside. You wouldn't hang outside of the person's house and be like, every morning, be like, hey, how are you? I mean, that'd be like a stalker, right? So you just have to use common sense, right? If there are opportunities where you may bump into each other, or this, that, or the other, if done once or twice, it actually may be quite effective. I'm not saying to go stalk and bump in, but my point is, if you know that everyone is doing a community service event, the company's shutting down for the day, and it's something you care about, not a bad thing to go pitch in, right? If it's done for the right reason. So, I mean, don't take that as like a specific example per se, but my point is, you may be downtown. Maybe you went downtown on purpose, but you may be downtown and you'll say, hey, I'm around. Would you like to grab a quick cup of coffee? So one suggestion I gave a UVA student not too long ago was, I believe that every Friday, that UVA student for the next month should go to Washington, D.C., because that's where they want to go work. And I would, every Friday, a couple weeks in advance, send it, or 2 weeks or a week in advance, send an email to potential people that they've met, right, that they've cultivated some level of relationship with, and be like, hey, by the way, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. next Friday. Not sure if you're going to be in the office or not, but if you are, I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee for a couple of minutes, right? To thank you for X, Y, and Z, right? Most people say, sure, I got 5 minutes. I like a free cup of coffee. You seem like a good kid. What ends up happening is you get to go there, you get to bond with that person, and if you're at their office, they may introduce you to 3 or 4 other people in the office. You're creating champions. Because at the end of the day, somebody has to actually care and pound the table that I like Victoria or that I like Michael, right? So there's ways of cultivating relationships. Again, I'm not trying to like make you guys think there's a formula and a script. There isn't. It has to be authentic. And that's why you only invest in the people you care about. You're not going to put all this time and effort for someone you go on a first date that you never want to go on a second date with, right? Same logic, common sense, use the dating framework if that's helpful, but you have to cultivate it. Then the other thing is think about like how you receive information from a company that you may like. They don't always send you, let's say you subscribe to a really fun like apparels company and you're on their like mail marketing list. They don't only send you sales information. Oh, tomorrow there's a big sale. If you only got that and you got that every single week, you'd be like, Jesus, stop bothering me, right? Turn off, unsubscribe. But if from time to time they sent you something of value because they actually know their customer, right? That would be like, oh, wow, that's actually something I care about. If from time to time they sent something that had nothing to do with trying to monetize you, right? Maybe it's just about a really cool thing that their CEO just did or the company just did, a community service event. You have to do different types of information and different forms of communication, like method tools, right? It's not just always email, so that you create a way to really holistically engage with that person. Hence why I mentioned the, hey, I'm coming to town, if you're around in person, coffee, this, that, or the other, right? You're creating new dimensions to how you guys can communicate. So I think those things are very helpful. I'm not saying to always do them. It has to be authentic, but when there are opportunities, you should do it. And that's why I mentioned earlier, you don't just say thank you emails. You sometimes send an update email so people know what's going on, right? I have a friend who every year, it's almost the longest thing on earth, but every year sends an update on her life to all of her friends and former colleagues. And I got to say, I read it every year cover to cover because she puts a ton of thought into it. It's actually super interesting, half the stuff she does. And in some weird way, it's like a cool way to feel connected outside of Instagram and everything else, right? And I really get to know, wow, that's her recap. That's her page recap of the year. That's like her annual update. So she takes a company approach. It's just her. So there's a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's about, again, communicating back something you learned from them that you enacted out in the marketplace or you read about. So it actually shows that you are actively listening. So there's different ways to message, right? What you're talking about, what the actual meat and potatoes of why you're communicating out. And there's different methods of communications to use. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, this is Michael Cox. Thank you very much.
Cool. Other questions or thoughts that I can help with, particularly for those that have interviews coming up?
Hey, Adrien. This is Maria again. So I was wondering, what can I expect of a super day? So I applied for the Winning Woman program, and it's supposed to be a panel first, and then there'll be a team project, and then afterwards it's 2 rounds of interviews. And I'm not really sure like what's going to be accounted for, like that's going to help me get the internship, and how I could, like, who I should be networking with at the same time, because the panel isn't just for the position that I'm applying for.
Is that JP Morgan Chase?
Yes.
So sorry, what is this panel? So it's like a panel event?
Yeah, so it's about top leaders in JP Morgan. So it's called the Winning Woman program. It's where the top leaders that are females are coming to talk about their experiences, breaking into the industry, about their experiences in JP Morgan and how they got to where they are today. After the panel, there's going to be a discussion breakout. Afterwards, there's like a team building project within the group that I'll be assigned to. And then afterwards, it's going to the department and having 2 rounds of interview.
Got it. Okay. So a couple of suggestions. One is I'm assuming, and I'm blanking on her name right now, but Michelle Beccaria, is that right? I'll look it up after this, but she's the head of all of campus recruiting globally for JP Morgan. She's probably going to be there, I would think, or at least some of her top lieutenants. So if you know who's attending on the city side, whether it's practitioner or HR, absolutely review who they are, particularly the panelists or moderators, right? Because you want to have a better sense of who they are so that you can be more intelligent. That's one. By the way, if you meet Michelle, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now, but if you've gone through Modern Guild, great, definitely let her know that, right? Because she definitely knows what Modern Guild is, right? On some high level at least. So that's one. Two, I would think about the purpose of the event. The purpose of the event is to inspire women, right, to climb the ladder and showcase successful executive women, right, and so that they can be an inspiration to younger women that are starting in their careers, right? So that's kind of part of the purpose. So having some sense of who inspires you, right? Who are women leaders? Well, maybe not women leaders, but something that inspires you to want to be a successful executive woman, right? In banking is going to be really important. One of the biggest problems that banks, actually most businesses have, but particularly in banking and consulting, is that they don't necessarily have a women attraction problem, right? Initial hiring. They have a women retention problem. And it's a real issue for 1,000 reasons, one of which, obviously a large one, is that still today, many women tend to choose family over career, right? More so than, let's say, a male. And so they tend to lose a lot of women because of the high demanding time, right? You look at consulting, people are traveling every single day. It's really difficult for any family member, right? But for some, it's just too unbearable, right? So they'd rather have a more consistent role that allows them to be home, et cetera, et cetera. So no problem, Victoria. Take care. I would think about that, right? Because that's one of their biggest challenges. If you know that going in, and you're able to talk about the inspiration of certain women leaders, particularly in finance, whether they're at Citi or elsewhere, I think will give them a lot of comfort to know that you are not only an attractive person to hire, but you may actually have a plus side in terms of retention. That's massive. So just know that's one of their biggest concerns. And if some of the high-end HR people are there, that's what they care about. The low-end recruiter just cares about checking their box and saying, we got a good quality hire. But Michelle cares about, do you stay here, right? So I think that's going to be important. Plus, it creates a real bonding experience to talk about, well, who are your women leaders, right? Who were you inspired by, right? And having some sense of historical women, not just current, is going to be really cool because it shows that you actually care about the event they're doing. So that's just a really nice way to bond. You get to know the people well by doing your research ahead of time. You also get to understand the event and what they're looking for, and so you're able to kind of start getting a little bit smarter about that. So you speak the language, right? You understand their cause. So you can have an empathy moment, right? So that's what I would recommend in terms of the panel and some of those things. The rest, I mean, obviously the interview, you got to practice on the interview. In terms of the group exercise and all that, you know, some of these companies are starting to do more and more like group cases, like similar to consulting and banking. Citi does. So I think you got to look at that and say, okay, how do I prepare for something like that? They're looking for teamwork skills, right? They're looking for a certain verbal and articulation skills, and obviously analytics. So you never want to be the person that is creating massive waves just to get the answer, right? Because nobody likes that person. And you don't want to be so passive that nobody knows, like, are you independent, right? So just striking a nice balance to understand that this is an opportunity to showcase your smarts, but not be so overly obsessed with having to do so, and understanding that it's important that that you're helping drive the results, but that you understand that at the end of the day, it's the team result that matters the most, right? So just because someone's wrong, you don't put them down to showcase how right you are. It's about coming together to create a better answer. So if you take that approach to that, I think people will see that, and then they'll judge you in a very, because again, they're evaluating you to some extent. They'll judge you in a very positive way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of how I would think about it. Obviously, the interview prep is the interview prep. We've already talked about that. But I think the panel event is a really cool opportunity for you to create real bonding with some pretty high level people at Citi.
Okay,
Sorry,
thank you so much.
at JP Morgan Chase.
It's okay. Yeah, that was really helpful. I didn't consider that aspect of researching about like female leaders within the financial institution. This is really great advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Do you know, by the way, do you know who the panelists are and who's the moderator and all those? Have they released that information or no?
No, so it's kind of funny because I had my interview yesterday and I found out I had Super Day for Monday in less than 24 hours.
Right.
And they didn't release any information, and they haven't talked to me about transportation either.
All these banks are hilarious. It's always the same thing. It's amazing. They do everything last minute, but don't worry about it. It will happen. But yeah, I mean, so what I would do right now is anticipate who they could be. So look at some of the senior leadership at JP Morgan Chase from a women's perspective, because obviously that's who they're most likely going to have as panelist and moderator. Take a look at Michelle Beccaria, right? Because she is the head of campus recruiting, and you definitely want to know who she is. Getting some sense of those people might be very helpful for you to get a little bit of an edge.
Thank you.
No worries.
I was wondering if I could also get your email so I could keep you updated.
Yeah, no worries. It's pretty simple. It's Adrien at modernguild.com, and Adrien is spelled the French way. So it's Adrien.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually recommended by a friend who went through Modern Guild.
Cool. Who was that?
Her name is Alejandra Blanca.
Oh yeah. How is she? Oh, she got an offer from Citi.
Yes. So I was talking to her about like how I had Super Day, and I was because I applied on Sunday and I didn't realize how fast interviews were coming in.
Right.
And so so I've been like talking to her, and she's been great. We're actually in the same club too.
Very cool. Very good. And remind me, are you guys at Cornell or Michigan?
We're at Cornell.
Cornell. Cool. We're actually doing a little project with the SBC club at Cornell around Modern Guild. So you'll probably be seeing a lot of information on Modern Guild starting in mid-October. So it'll be interesting. They're trying to figure out how best to communicate what Modern Guild is to college students. But very cool. Well, listen, if I can be helpful at all, keep me updated for sure. My brother actually works at JP Morgan Chase, but in the Fund of Fund group. So a little bit different, but we have tons and tons of mentors in our network that are JP Morgan Chase. So for future reference, being able to tap into that might be helpful as well.
Okay. I also saw that there's an application that's due on September 30th.
Yes.
Would it be too late for me to apply now, even though I just joined like today?
No, it's not too late, and you can apply. Just to be clear, right, to set expectations correctly. September 30, we basically have rolling applications. So every month there's an application. We review it at the end of the month, and we look at we do it every month. But we have multiple start dates throughout the year. So right now, the next start date is mid-October, and largely, let's call it juniors and seniors are probably going to be the major focus point because they're freaking out, and we need to help them, right? Many of the sophomores don't need help right now, but they'll need a lot more help in the spring semester. So if you're obviously a junior or senior, then I'd recommend applying. There'll probably be a bigger focus, to be honest, on consulting than finance. But I know you're interested in finance, so don't worry about it. I would still apply. And even whenever you apply, just so everyone knows on the call, you're always eligible for any start date. So even if you don't get into the next start date for whatever reason, you're automatically eligible for the next one and the next one and the next one, right? So, it's just sometimes a question of how popular how many spots there are for that particular program, et cetera, et cetera. So don't be discouraged if for whatever reason you don't get in, not to say that you won't, because typically we have about a 20% acceptance rate. So it's challenging, but it's certainly manageable. So absolutely apply. Just keep in mind that it's a fair amount of work, right? So it's a good 5 hour. I mean, your friend Alejandro can tell you, but it's about 5 hours a week. So you just need to be mindful of that, particularly if you're like massively in the thick of interviews. You may say, well, I kind of wish I had done this before. But if you're able to manage both and do the recruiting and do all this, then I highly recommend you apply.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries. Other questions or thoughts, guys? Seems like most people have dropped off. And by the way, feel free to drop off. I'm going to hang out just for a couple more minutes in case anybody else has questions. But otherwise, feel free to drop off if you don't have any questions or don't have some other pressing things to do.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to drop off and prepare.
Cool. Okay, good luck.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.